So what does the group want to do in terms of like next steps? We've got the use cases document that we still need to flesh out. Obviously, use case one is interoperability. With that in mind, I created a spreadsheet that I'm starting to work on capturing the different types of data that need to be represented in CycloneDX so that we actually can achieve interoperability. I'm also documenting like what tool those fields that data was observed in being in. So I mean, for me personally, I have access to well, obviously OTM's a spec, but I have access to Iris Risk, Dragon, Fork, and Davichi. So those are the tools that I use.
Hmm.
Obviously, there's Microsoft tool, there's Threat Modeler, a few others. But anyway, I've been trying to capture the data that we're going to need in order to achieve use case one.
So I've been talking with John Gatson
Yeah, yeah.
of Threat Dragon, and we are trying to put together something that PyTM would output and Threat Dragon will be able to consume and also to output. The way
Yep.
that we've been thinking of things lately is that these are two examples of tools that are simple. One of them is GUI oriented, visual. The other one is code oriented. And we see them as starter blocks to the whole
Hmm.
thing. So because they are such simple tools, we could say this is where people go first just to take to get the free taste, and then they move to the more capable and bigger tools. And if we are able to create uh, uh, a format that is expressive enough at that step, at that beginning, and then show that bigger tools can consume the thing, and that at the end of the chain, like we spoke about in the Slack channel, that other tools can consume that and interact with that format, and that there is enough information in there, we would consider that that would be a good draft, right?
That's
So
basically OTM today. Because like I can import and export from Iris Risk, Davichi, and Threat Dragon.
yes, but as it is, we think that OTM is a bit too oriented for things that are GUI based. So
Mm.
one of the requirements in there, for example, is XY coordinates.
Right.
Don't think that that should be a must, right? Let the tool figure out the layout or whatever. But it's more information than we think should be part of the TM oriented
Right.
format or whatever. And the other thing is we will probably, for example, to express that use case that I mentioned, the one where I would have I don't know, Defect Dojo find something on the SCA side and say, oh, the threat model told me that this component is more important than the other components, so this is more critical than the other,
Okay. Yep.
right? To express that, we would have to have more information in the format today that for OTM would be one more field, one more extra field. And we
Right.
want to elevate that to something that's actually important to be there so that the format can be useful at the end of the chain.
Hmm. Yep. So is the work on getting that exercise, are you planning to kind of provide that feedback back to this group? Because it would be
That's the
immensely
idea.
useful.
That's the
Okay.
idea, I believe, right?
Okay.
The things that right now, I think that both for John, I don't want to speak for him, but for myself, it's not exactly the top of my box right now. That there's a couple of things that need to happen before I can dedicate myself to that. But it's definitely something that we are discussing and actively working on.
No, that'd be great. That'd be great. I would love to see kind of the output of that. I think that would be really useful. One of the things that I think, I don't know if it's part of our use cases or not. I have to go back to the document and find out. But I think as an industry, it would be really important for us to place an emphasis on automate where automation is possible. And obviously you can't automate human thought, but things like requiring XY coordinates, yeah, the first step of threat modeling is just figuring out what you have and what you need to protect, right? And I can automate that all day long. But I don't have XY coordinates for those types of things, right? I may not even have some other types of data like what is in scope for those things, right? Or maybe even who the owners are, because attribution in some organizations is going to be hard.
Hmm.
So figuring out like what is going to be minimum, what's going to be required, and obviously there's going to be a lot of optional things. I think is going to be really important if we want to encourage automation in our industry. My opinion.
Not only that, but in the abstract world that a threat model lives versus a very concrete world that code and deployment lives, to make sure that you have a consistent view, consistent naming of objects,
Hmm.
and making sure, for example, that the blob that got drawn in the threat model stage became this number of microservices on the other side, and you can relate both things and keep that relationship somewhere that today we don't know where it's going to be.
Right.
Right.
Right. Yeah, there's obviously proprietary solutions for this, but yeah, being able to represent this in a standard that all the tools could be able to theoretically represent or consume,
Mm-hmm.
I think. Yeah.
So the relationship between having a format and who consumes and produces the format and who has the right or the duty to update that format is another big question that I have.
Mm.
So, for example, I start with a TM format that has those big blobs, and down the road, somebody defines the actual processes that are part of that one big blob. Who has the responsibility of naming things differently? Who writes on which
Mm.
BOM the new facts? Or
Mm.
is that
Mm.
an external thing? Do we need a relationship map somewhere?
Right. Right. Right.
These things are not clear to me.
Yeah. 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 So it
Yeah,
sounds like you're
if
kind of
I oh
describing.
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Kim.
Yeah, no, go ahead. I was gonna start another topic, so
Oh,
go
I
first.
was just trying to envision what it was that Izar was trying to capture. It's almost like version history, if you will, a version history / audit log almost. Like who labeled what things, and then you're also like applying, I guess, roles and responsibilities to different types of objects.
I see what you mean. Don't think that a version history is exactly the analogy that I was looking for, but it's more like a refinement of the design, right?
Mm.
So I have this blobby design, and as it gets implemented and deployed, it gets more defined. So
Mm.
what I have at the beginning and what I have at the end must match. So there needs to be a relationship between these two views. But who's responsible for that mapping and where we store that? That's a
Mm.
question that I still have.
Okay. Okay.
Now, in the point of version history, it could be that at some point, this final view that you have becomes the initial view of the threat model,
Right.
right? Because it's representing the system in a more detailed way. So it could be that eventually you have a full migration from reality in over design, and that design becomes the reality.
Right. Right.
And that then, as a form of version history, you would store both of them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But
Yep.
how that happens and where it lives, that's something that it's still unclear to me.
That would be a really good use case to capture. Could you add that in the
In the
uh
doc,
yeah, could you? I think that's a really important one to start capturing and trying to flesh out if we can do that.
Yeah, I'll have to go back to this recording because I have no idea what I just said. But
No worries. That's why we record this stuff.
I mean, I remember that it made sense while I was saying it, but I have no idea.
No, I kind of get where you're coming from. All right, Kim.
yes. Yeah. So what you were saying earlier about fleshing out the data you need to capture and different use cases, it triggered some ideas from a privacy perspective, because I think we need additional information on more specific details on the data, on the individuals, on the purposes. Things that you typically don't need for security that can also extend into additional use cases, because that might be extracted into something that can be used for records of processing activities or inputs for a DPIA, things that legal people would love from a privacy compliance perspective. But is that still within scope of this project?
It absolutely is.
Yep.
And the unfortunate reality is that most of the threat modeling tools really just focus on security. And as you know, Kim, I actually, purchased a couple of those Linden Go card decks. And during the
It was
on-site,
you.
it was me. So during the my team had an on-site in San Diego like 3 weeks ago, and on a Friday we actually got out the cards and we started to play, and it was a very enlightening experience for every single one of us, because it made us think about things in a completely different way, right? We're always thinking about, well, how can the adversary, do whatever, right? And in this case, I mean, we're thinking about, like, especially like when you, I think one of the threats was like about like taking little bits and pieces of data and then being able to assimilate that into like a profile or whatever it was. Like, oh, well, yeah, that would be a very big privacy thing, right? And so putting on that privacy hat was really educational, I think, to the entire team. We got a lot out of it. We're probably going to do a little bit more of that, because as we start working more and more with our friends in privacy over on AI stuff, both teams kind of need to be able to kind of understand and work with one another. So that's kind of what we did with that. But yeah, we need to be able to capture all the data, because threat modeling, I also have, in my day job, I not only care about the privacy and security, but in some cases we actually care about safety. And if we can capture those three elements, I think that would be a huge win. And if I'm missing something, let me know. But those three elements, I think, are really important.
Yeah, that
Steve?
makes sense. If you're talking about AI, I guess ethics and that kind of thing might be added too, although I'm not sure whether that's easy to capture at a lower level technical perspective, but it might be worth looking into.
If you have, Kim, any ramblings, notes, points to tools, etc., that have kind of a list of the different types of data that you would love to capture from a privacy perspective, I think that would be a good discussion point on, in trying to incorporate that information into the specification the best way that we can.
Okay, I don't think there is the list, but I can at least try to come up with a couple of things I think are important. Definitely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Awesome.
Steve, this is my first meeting for this one here, and I say that because you and I are in so many meetings together. I don't know what you're looking for. I haven't read the use cases yet. Are you looking to create a format for what things are today or what they should be tomorrow?
That is a really great question. So initially, we've got a couple different things in the hopper for 1.7. The current release of CycloneDX is 1.6. It is an international standard at this point. 1.7 will be as well. For 1.7, we're working on, outside of the threat modeling work, we're working on OSS sustainability, which is a big thing in and of itself. But that's what's applicable to this group, is that we're working on this concept called blueprints. And I think we talked about this last time, Chris, but blueprints are really two different things. It's one, an architectural bill of material, how something is actually architected. And that's not necessarily the same as the threat model. Just, you know, this is not trying to reinvent UML. This is more of an abstract view of something that's architected. And then we're also starting to capture, as part of blueprints, we want to capture BOB, or bill of behaviors. What is something supposed to do versus what it actually does, right? And when you combine that capability with threat modeling, and our ability to represent standards and requirements, well, if you went like a couple more steps, you could theoretically say in the future, not 1.7, but in the future, you could theoretically say that, well, I have these threats or these gaps that exist, and I have these requirements, all of which is documented in CycloneDX, by the way. And in order for me to meet said requirement, I need to have these other things in place. And that other thing in place is that might be a 1.8 thing. I don't know if we're going to get to that in 1.7, but that's kind of where we're going.
So you're bumping right up against what I'm working on right now.
Yeah.
And this is not my day job. This is something that a labor of love that I'm working on is, you know, lots of different kinds of threat modeling. Right, in my opinion, where we're at is we're stuck at crawl. We need to kind of kick it into walk, forget about run, but we're definitely at the low level. Right now, threat modeling is a process, especially asset threat modeling, where you're supposed to just give and expose this to a human mind so they can then deduce, oh, there's an issue here with this. That's great, but it doesn't scale. And you wind up with a lot of threat modeling fatigue. What I'm working on right now is through, there are two different model-based system engineering standards in the world, SysML and Arcadia, the two big ones. And I'm working with the tool for Arcadia called Capella to use model-based systems engineering as the basis for the threat model. And the threat model is basically automatic as you come out of this. Why? Because you have all the requirements in there. You have things that today nobody threat models. For instance, impacts to timing. So I'm looking at this and saying, I need to transfer every 120 milliseconds a packet over this communication medium. And all of a sudden, it's not a denial of service. It is stale data that it's going to expose. Nobody does that. People do DOS, but nobody does stale data looking at this. Very important, though, crucially important. Data has to arrive when it arrives. Well, all those requirements are already in your model-based systems engineering platforms. And there are interchange formats like REC-IF that is already established for exchanging this kind of information between the different platforms. So that's why I bring all this up. I think that's where the future is. I think us as a separate threat modeler, this is our crawl phase. Once we get into walk or God forbid run, we're going to be looking at more mature tools that are taking in all the requirements of the system, that are tying them all together. And then threat modeling will actually be an automatic activity. Likewise with the mitigations coming out of it. Okay, so I want to sit here and I want to encrypt that 120 millisecond packet with elliptic curve cryptography, but I don't have a hardware accelerator for that. I'm doing it all in software, and that's going to take me 150 milliseconds. I can't use that mitigation. Right? All of this stuff falls out automatically when you're doing model-based systems engineering. All that information is there already. And so I think that's what I'm playing with. That's where I see things going. It always, threat modeling drives me insane because of the fact it's such a limited scope and viewpoint. Okay. And it's like, it shouldn't be this way. And we shouldn't be the ones having to think about it. It should be automatically derived as we put in all of these requirements.
Just a small parenthesis in there. My experience with SysML is that architects look at me and say, if I have to describe the system using the granularity that this thing wants, I might as well just go and write the system.
And SysML, I'm not particularly a fan of. I've used it for decades, but it is a series of graphics that you can use, be it activities, use cases, sequence diagrams, whatever you want to use. And it is not a process. Look at Arcadia or the tool Capella that came out of the EU. It's been used for years now for mission critical aerospace, trains, planes, aerospace vehicles, anything like that. And it's been used very effectively. And it came out of engineers like myself saying, SysML is nice, but it doesn't really do it for us. And this system does. It is a process. It is a totalitarian, starting at the very beginning and decomposing it all the way down into logical and then physical implementations. So if you're defining your system well enough up front with the requirements, you don't need to do those granularity. It's going to be derived for you. And in fact, there's code generators directly out of this that can create code directly out of these models. So it's a thing. And if you're not thinking enough about it, and when somebody says a comment like that, my first thought is, oh, you're ignoring a whole lot of things. You shouldn't be ignoring it. Right? That's not necessarily a requirement, but these things can be derived from the requirements. It's a real deal. I wouldn't use SysML for this. Would not.
I found Capella MBSE2. Is that the one?
Yep. That's the tool. The standard is Arcadia.
Arcadia. Looks interesting.
It does.
Yeah,
look interesting.
Izar.
This is new to me.
Anytime you want to work on this, this is what I'm doing right now. Because I've gotten sick to death of using the standard tools where then everybody gets to sit there and hand derive this. And we've got spreadsheets for scoring and we're doing bullshit. Let the system do it. Let the system identify them. Let the system go through and automatically create mitigations from that as well.
You said my trigger word, spreadsheet.
Yeah.
Oh God, no.
Yeah. I know, but that's what we're doing. That's what everybody's doing. And it's like,
I don't know about you, but I'm not doing any spreadsheets.
I'm not doing that. But some people do, I'm sure.
Well, one of the things we do is after we're doing threat modeling is the results of that, you then have to go through and do vulnerability scoring against. Well, none of these systems do this well. So it's like, okay, now how do I do a vulnerability scoring? And what is that vulnerability rubric that I'm using? And so to know, okay, here is the priority to mitigate these. I hate this approach, by the way. I'm not advocating it. I'm just saying it's the reality today. So yeah, here we are.
With out of curiosity, I don't want to take too much time on Arcadia, but out of curiosity, it seems to do software and systems. Can Arcadia also represent processes?
Yes, yeah, it does. And in fact, you mean processes in the digital sense or processes in the human sense? Like
no, in the human sense. Like
no, it does not. No, it does not.
Okay.
No. So if you're doing process there, you're stuck back to attack trees kind of thing, and doing that. But no, this is very much technical. It is made, as I started that off saying, there's a lot of different kinds of threat modeling. This is very much oriented toward the asset threat modeling approach.
Got it. This is interesting.
Yeah.
I have to look into this.
Yeah, it's starting to remind me of a certain methodology.
What's that?
Later. Different call.
All right. But yeah, I mean that's kind of where we're going, Chris.
So either for this or for blueprints, you might want to look at REQIF. It's an existing REQ requirement REQIF. It's for requirements interchange format. And that might be useful to harmonize with them, or at least they've defined that right. And that's been in use for a long time.
Requirements interchange format?
Yep. Might be something useful in there. In the blueprint side of things, if not in this one.
Right. Okay.
it's XML. I'm blind. I'm blind.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of that here. There's another one called IBM XMI. Take a guess, since the X is there, what its format it is. And it's like,
Yeah.
I try to get past that.
The thing that you know, what's interesting to a lot of folks who are not necessarily into standards all that much is that a standard itself is just human readable stuff, right? It's a document. I mean, I think the standard for CycloneDX is, you know, 600 pages, right? So something along those lines. So if you want your eyes to bleed, I would encourage you to read the entirety of the specification. But then you have like these other things, like again in Cyclone we support protobuf, XML, and JSON, and I kind of view like the JSON schema, for example, as an interpretation of the standard. And then, of course, you have libraries that then implement those interpretations of the standard. So it's, as you keep on going down, you kind of get to these concrete things. But we're trying to actually work on the standard, right? Because that's the thing that matters. And then everything else will be derived from that. So yeah, that was kind of an interesting. I've been having to kind of like put that in my own mind and kind of explain that to some folks over like the last couple of months, actually, now that CycloneDX is in fact a standard. And that's just kind of a different way of thinking about things.
I chastised NetRise the other day. They can only ingest a 1.4 format
1.4.
file.
Oh, that's
And
so quaint.
that pretty close to what I said to him. I says, you guys got to get your act together. 1.6 is current and 7's on this, right around the corner here. So it's like, because we're getting in SBOMs that are 1.5 and 1.6, and it's like, and it can't handle it.
Right. Yeah.
Guys.
And there's been so many more, I mean, besides just the version bump, but there's been so many really good improvements between 1.4 and 1.6, specifically targeted for security and all the evidence.
Yep.
So
yep,
yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, Chris has given me some reading homework.
Indeed.
So, so what does the group want to do in terms of cooks? So I know kind of what Izar and John are going to be working on. So that's great, and we would love to be able to capture the output of that. What does the rest of the group kind of want to do in terms of like next steps, right? We've got that use cases document. We've got a spreadsheet that I'm trying to put together of all the different types of data that we need to be able to capture. But I think maybe there's maybe like a middle ground of between the use cases and the low level details. What types of data do we want to capture in the first place, right? We talked a little bit about privacy data, right? We need to capture security data. We need to capture potentially safety data. Obviously the asset and asset inventory. What is it that we're working on? What's in scope? One of the things that I wanted to possibly do in the spec is, if we have a standard that can represent any kind of threat model, that means that a lot of different eyes, a lot of different teams could potentially view that threat model from their own lens. So what's in scope for one team might be out of scope for another team. And being able to represent the various scopes that exist and who's responsible for them might be something interesting that we could potentially include in that. I don't know. Where does the group kind of want to start is kind of the question. Because we could start a lot of different places.
So I think that the safest bet, as most things connected to most things threat modeling, is to start at the first three of the four questions. What are we building? What could go wrong? What are we going to do about it? That to me is the minimal set of information that you have to start with, right? From there, you can always add and pile up as much as you want. And that applies to safety and to privacy as well.
Yeah, especially for the what can go wrong, right?
Well, I think the first question is the one that's the big boy there. What are we building?
What are we building? Yeah. Simple question.
No, simple question, not a
Complex.
simple answer.
Right.
The question is simple, the answer not so much.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
But if you look at it like that simple question behind it, you can see from the obvious, okay, this is the thing that we are building. But you get to answer from the software architecture point of view, from the deployment point of view, from the privacy / data / bad things that could, not bad things, that's the second one. The things that are important to me in terms of chaining all that data, the data that I can't live without. For the safety side, I'm sure there's all kinds of not requirements, but constraints in terms of this has to be able to go into water or not, and stuff like that. Don't mix electricity and wet things, and that's kind of good stuff. So I think that translating that simple question to the scope of each one of those three fields, security, safety, and privacy, and seeing what derives from that would be a good first step.
All right.
Yeah, not bad. And these are, I think they are requirements. They're functional and non-functional requirements. But
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Okay. So what are we building? Oh, right. That's the first question.
Mhm.
I think it's the first question, but we only need to look at the things that are relevant to know to answer the second question. But the thing is, we're capturing the second question also so broadly that we basically need to capture a lot. But yeah, so it's, to me, it's still an open question to determine what is all the stuff we need to know in order to do the best threat elicitation. I'm not giving answers. I'm just putting out more questions there.
The specification does support requirements today. So we can represent standards and requirements. There's multiple OWASP standards that are available in CycloneDX format today, things like ASVS. So as we are starting to describe what we're building and what can go wrong, we can reference those requirements or the lack of implementation of those requirements as things that could go wrong, right? We can represent any standard though. And so theoretically we could represent GDPR or anything else in a machine readable way. Do we want to, so that's standards and requirements. Do we also want to capture constraints, right? If we know what the constraints are before we build something, and the answer of what can go wrong, what can go wrong is, in most threat models that I've seen, is usually like a technical problem that leads to a safety or security or privacy issue, right? But what could go wrong if you have constraints defined up front? What could go wrong is that, well, I have too big of a backlog, therefore my SLA is never going to be met.
Yeah, what can go wrong is very domain specific.
Right.
So if you're doing process threat modeling, it's a whole different thing than asset threat modeling.
Right.
And if you're doing something like asset threat modeling, it's more technical. So all of a sudden I can start going to common weakness enumeration, CWEs, and start referencing those as a way of communicating what can go wrong. But if you're talking about process, I'm not aware of anybody creating a topology of what can go wrong in process, pretty much anything.
Yeah, like I think it was the last call that we had. Tony UV from Versprite was on, and I was mentioning, because somebody asked a question, hey, are you guys going to capture processes in your threat model as well? Processes in the human sense, not the technical one. And my answer was, absolutely. And I remember going to an AppSec Cali talk that Tony UV gave probably in, I don't know, 2018, 2019, something like that. And he threat modeled, I think, the US Postal Service, right? The process of sorting mail. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. So yeah, we definitely need to, because right now CycloneDX doesn't, I mean, it handles some process. You can think of formulation is a implementation of a specific type of process, but I think we need process in a more general sense in the standard itself as well.
It's going to be a nightmare.
No, I think we just need to kind of approach it from the big lens perspective. And like everything else that we do in CycloneDX, developing a standard that is prescriptive and which is flexible, yet minimizes the opportunities for the users of the standard to shoot themselves in the foot. Right? That's kind of what we've done the entire way, right? You be prescriptive enough, you be flexible enough, and it minimizes the chances of them interpreting the specification incorrectly. And then, of course, you follow that up with all the guides, right? We've got guides for SBOM and CBOM and attestations, and we will eventually have a guide for this as well. So you put all these things together, and I think we can do it, Chris. But it's going to take some effort, and maybe we design it in a way where we don't achieve everything in 1.7. But we design it in a way where things can be added to 1.7 in the follow-up releases, right? Because we always have to think about how we design a specification, knowing that we're not going to get everything we want up front. So how do we extend that in the future, knowing 3, 4, 5 releases in advance? Because that's kind of what we do.
Without breaking compatibility. So I mean, the ultimate flexible is you put a string in there, right? Yeah, well, then everybody does slightly different formatting of what goes into the string, and suddenly you don't know what maps to what.
Right.
But yeah, an enum is much more definitive, but good God, that's just an insane amount of things that can go wrong. I mean, I'm just thinking about the US Postal Service, and it's like somebody put too many stamps on top. The envelope is too thick. You have glue that's exposed. You can't read the handwriting. It's in a different language. It's the wrong size envelope. It jams in the machine. I mean, good God, just that one.
Right. But I think it comes a lot of what we need to work. I think get right initially is just vocabulary. Somebody mentioned like vocabulary early on in this call, and they're absolutely right. Because if you look at like something like Stride, they have a thing called a process, but it's not what most people would consider a process. Right. So just being able to come up with the right nouns is going to be crucially important for us.
Look, just spitballing here, but there's a reason why there is such a thing called the English language and another one called JSON, right? With the English language, you can represent whatever you want and you can express whatever you want, and it's a beautiful language. And JSON is just there for those things that you need JSON to express. And if we need if we decide to embrace the ocean right now and start saying this is going to have to express processes and systems and, I don't know, gadgets and whatnot, we're going to end up like talking about meanings and definitions and all that good stuff for years, and nothing is going to come out of it. I mean, been there, done that. I much prefer that we say this is what we're focusing first, limit it to that in a very strong way, do all the things that Steve said, that, hey, maintain expandability later on, but definitely let's start small.
Yep, I agree with that.
Yep.
But again, we need to get our naming of things correct. I just brought up the process.
The second hardest thing in computer science, eh? Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Just naming stuff. Yes. Yeah.
I say we just call everything foo, and if we're missing some name, just call it bar.
Fantastic. Okay. Are there anything other than maybe requirements and constraints that we need to start thinking about, not necessarily designing yet, but thinking about prior to identifying what is it that we're going to build?
Well, the only thing before requirements are things like voice of customer, voice of business that informs requirements and constraints. But I don't know if we need to or even want to capture that here.
Yeah.
Because those are very nebulous things. They are not requirements. They're not written like a requirement. They're not single focused. The customer wants it cheap and easy to use, as an example. Okay. Because yeah, they always do. All right. There's two requirements right there built into one phrase. So it's not a requirement. So I'm not certain it's worth going above it.
Okay. All right. Well, I mean, we don't have to completely flesh that out right now. I'm just taking notes right now. We want to dive into what are we building?
Yeah.
Okay. So what are we building? Today, CycloneDX handles software components, hardware components, services, and data. Those are the types of things that CycloneDX really supports today. And I think for most of our threat modeling, like we're talking about MVP, right? I think that's a really good start, right? Being able to model like an IoT device, or being able to model an AI system. You being able to threat model an automobile, the software systems of an automobile, right? These are all things that CycloneDX can do today. Or I mean, at least those are the types of components that CycloneDX can represent today. Obviously, we mentioned process earlier. That's something that it doesn't really handle today. And if we decide as a group that we don't want to go down that road in 1.7, that's fine. We can kick that down to 1.8. All right. As long as we kind of leave room for that to exist in the future. Is there anything other than software components, hardware components, data, and services that we need to support?
No, I wish Matt was here. He's great at this stuff.
But I think what that points out is that one of the elements we're going to need in this, Jason, is calling out what type of a threat model this is early on, because it's going to affect the rest of the format of this tremendously.
That was something that Tony UV actually brought up during our first call, where we discussed the possibility of having like multiple perspectives in the threat model itself, right? Nothing would be precluding for capturing like Linden, Pasta, and Stride in the same thing, right? And being able to represent those three methodologies, and because I think those methodologies are going to capture different types of data too, might actually be really useful, right? I have limited knowledge of pasta. My knowledge of pasta is more academic, and more recently it's been guided through the use of Fork, which is their pasta based threat modeling tool. So that's kind of my limitation of that methodology. Linden obviously is something brand new to me, but it's very Stride like. So I understand their perspective of where they're coming from and how they do things. And then of course, a lot of people just kind of have their own methodologies, right? Matt's threat modeling methodology, which is a lot of the threat models that I see. But yeah, being able to capture like what things like I could help the consumer of this data format identify what fields
The
they
origin
need to,
was. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And by the way, Octave is probably the biggest elephant out there. It's probably got the most data fields of anything. So
Interesting. Yeah, I haven't used that word in a long time.
yeah, darn good reason why.
Does CycloneDX has the idea of a dictionary data
We
type?
a dictionary data type. Elaborate.
So in my head, a format like this, at the end of the day, it would express what the flaw identified was, what like the idea of the finding is what got identified, perhaps the suggested mitigation, and some form of prioritization for that thing. Then I would add to it one more field saying which methodology was used for that.
Mhm.
And based on that field, that would, I don't want to say force, but require a different set of fields that goes together with that methodology, so that we
Mhm.
don't have to overload the finding thing and connect it to the methodology in a hard way,
Okay.
right? So if that exists in the standard and can be expressed that way, I think that it would be best.
Okay. Yeah.
It would also go to expandability. You can always add one more to that dictionary.
I agree. Well, ideally it's expressive enough to say, well, we did a combination of Stride and part of Linden and part of I don't know what, or we used MITRE ATT&CK to I don't know. But if you limit people to say, okay, we're starting this TM bomb thing and it will be only Stride, well, that's too prescriptive. You want to be able to mix and match and combine. Maybe you can annotate findings and link that to bits and pieces of known methodologies so that tools can pick that up or something like that, but not saying, and this is a Stride TM bomb. Well, it can be, but it doesn't only have to be like that.
So
Right.
yeah.
The CycloneDX does have like a dictionary. We call it properties. It's basically name value pairs. The challenge with that, and we have a formal taxonomy to registering that, so it's kind of like DNS. So like if GitHub, for example, or GitLab actually has their own taxonomy that's formally registered, right? The challenge with that is that whether you're using JSON or XML, you can't validate those things. So while we do use it for extensibility, what we do try to do is think of all the different types of fields that we want the spec to natively support, because that native support can then be validated. And then the properties, they really can't, not with JSON and XML schema. You actually have to do business logic validation on top of that, which is something that CycloneDX doesn't do. In most of the spec, properties are actually supported. So I would expect properties to be supported in the TM portions of the spec that we'll develop. So you know, whenever there's a field that can't be represented natively, we're going to have properties available that you can plug those values into, and you just need a corresponding tool to know what those properties are in advance. So we do have a property taxonomy up on GitHub where a list of all the taxonomies are located and who registered them. So that does exist. We've got 4 minutes left. What are we going to work on is a really big topic. What does the group want to do in terms of having a place to write down all of our ideas on what is it that we're working on? Do we want like a Google Doc? Do we want a spreadsheet? Do we want
Google Doc?
Google Doc?
Google Doc, not a spreadsheet. Please, not a spreadsheet.
All right.
Please.
Perhaps we can put a new section in the requirements doc then, to kind of use that as kind of a scratch pad for what are we working on, because then once we kind of solidify what we're working on, those will eventually be requirements that will then go into that document anyway.
I think we're still in the raging phase here, so we'll be raging about this for a while.
Yeah, well, threat modeling, I mean, it's such a big topic. We could boil the ocean, but I don't think none of us want to do that.
As Izar said, we'll get nothing done if we do that.
Right, exactly. We'll be like another standards body that takes 5 years to create a standard.
Yeah,
We'll be
please
ISO.
no.
We can be ISO. We'll work on something. Or Bluetooth, the Bluetooth SIG. There are Bluetooth. I saw a Bluetooth profile ratified here about 6 months ago that I started 8 years ago.
I cringe, Chris.
Yeah.
I was like, that's still in play? 8 years?
Wow. Okay, I'm adding a new section to the document. What are we working on? Let's go ahead and I'm going to put this in the chat. And then next time we meet up, hopefully we can have some ideas of what we're working on and start identifying the gaps that might exist in the current specification. Those gaps will then lead to the requirements, right? So if folks can start chiming in there, that would be fantastic. And then we can start prioritizing what things we want to go in 1.7, what things we want to kick down the road to 1.8 or 1.9. Because again, we don't want to boil the ocean. Cool. All right, I'm exhausted. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for
Thank you.
participating. I really appreciate it, Chris, Izar, Kim. So hopefully we can make some progress now that we kind of have some direction of what it is that we want to do and maybe how we want to get there, hopefully. So anyway, until next time.
Great to see you all.
All right.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.